Arrogant millionaire dares waitress to dance. Seconds later, he regrets everything. It didn't happen in a fairy book where people learn their lessons on schedule. It happened under chandeliers the color of baked honey, in a ballroom where a single plate cost more than a month in a modest queen's walk-up, and the carpet tried to hush even the sins that stuck to the soles of shoes. The Grand Astoria put its ceilings up as if God might drop by to check the plaster, and the air wore too many perfumes at once. Lilies flown farther than most people travel, champagne with a sting in the nostrils, and the old, expensive ghosts of Chanel that remembered Paris before rent control. Cassandra Riley shouldered a silver tray through that soft storm of scent and money the way a ferry shoulders a crowded river, steady, practical, and not much thanked for it, and told the tremor in her arches that the night was only 8 hours old, not 16, no matter what her bones said. She kept her eyes at the right height, low enough to be safe, high enough to be useful, and threaded between tables where diamond necklaces caught light like fishing lures and pulled compliments out of men who had been pre-caught since college. The band off by the stage stroked its instruments into something polite. The sound rose warm as good soup, and Cassie let it touch her without letting it in. Inside, a smaller orchestra tuned up. Bill due on the 15th, grocery total hovering near the red, the memorized phrasing of a letter that a committee in clean shoes had mailed that morning. The Donovan Academy. Alumni Grant Committee regrets to inform you. Regret was a delicate word for an iron door. She passed Mrs. Genevieve Peterson at the service station, a woman who carried stress like a handbag and kindness like a spare handkerchief. The manager had given her the usual pre-shift wisdom pressed into a whisper. Head up, Riley. They can smell fear. Be polite, be efficient, and don't engage. Cassie understood that fear got scented faster than soup. She also knew efficiency didn't keep blisters from counting to 10 in hot little voices. The tray rim bit into her palm the way questions do when they've been waiting too long for answers. The night's charity flag said St. Jude's Children's Foundation, and the donors wore their virtue like fresh tailoring. They paid 5 figures for a table and expected the table to know it. Cassie moved in the old dance of service. Incline pour, retreat. Smile refill, vanish. Be the hinge on the door that never squeaks. She placed a flute of Dom Perignon, cold, obedient, lively, near a woman whose earrings would have covered a year of rent in Brooklyn and another year if they came with matching bracelet. The woman laughed a laugh that didn't use her stomach or her eyes and turned her head like a lighthouse keeps time. Cassie felt a new weight from across the carpet, the kind of look that probes for a weak spot as if a person were a wall. She raised her gaze and found the eyes of Preston Montgomery III. Even if the name didn't ring, the type told from a long way off. His jaw declared a long friendship with good breeding. His sandy hair parted clean as a ledger, and the Rolex on his wrist ticked louder than most people's hopes. He didn't sit in his chair so much as drape himself over it like successful ivy. The family had stapled its surname on more glass than daylight could pass through, and he wore the inheritance like a silk tie that never catches indoors. To his right perched Veronica Davenport, thin, polished, and lacquered in a red that forbade competition, watching the proceedings with the amused detachment of a person who never had to carry her own umbrella. To his left were 2 ready-made gentlemen Cassie named, for bookkeeping purposes, Chad and Bryce. They produced laughter on request, which is a kind of farming done indoors. Preston looked at Cassie in that museum of the poor way. Not quite seeing, not quite missing, as if she were an interesting insect on the wrong plate. He nudged Veronica with two fingers that hadn't met a callus. "Look at this one," he said, in a drawl that knew the room would help it travel. "Wound up in the back and let loose." Veronica's mouth cut into a smile that glittered like broken glass under a streetlight. Cassie, who was replacing a water glass with the tenderness one gives to breakable truth, kept her hands on the work and her thoughts disciplined like recruits. She finished the circle of refills, the tray never wobbling, and aimed herself toward the next need. Preston raised a hand, and the air obeyed. "Excuse me," he said, and people who weren't excused stopped talking so they wouldn't miss anything. "You missed a spot." Cassie turned and found the spot. It was a bead of water so small a stingy ant would have shaken its head. The crystal had given it birth. The linen had taken it in. Preston pointed like a magistrate. "There," she leaned with a napkin, the kind with a crest that remembered kings, and blotted the bead into history. Her tone stayed professional, which is what you call kind when it has to show up on time. "My apologies, sir." "I'll take care of that." He eased back, letting the tuxedo do more boasting on his behalf. "I'm not sure a cloth will rectify the general atmosphere of incompetence." The word rectify came out smooth as a newly minted coin. He set his flute down with a click, made for microphones, and shifted his eyes toward the small stage where the band had finished something safe and was now field testing a tango. Bandoneon wheeze, bass heartbeat, violin sharpening its knives, music that didn't ask permission to be felt. He smiled like a boy about to throw a frog into Sunday school. "I have a proposition." Cassie didn't move. When a rich man proposes in public, it's rarely marriage and never mercy. The tables near them angled like sunflowers seeking light. "My friends and I were discussing how people have forgotten what passion feels like," he said, gesturing to a room where passion wore jewels and kept good posture. "Everyone's so stiff, so lifeless." His eyes walked back to Cassie and settled with proprietary ease. "I'll bet you've never felt a real moment in your life." Her answer was the way she breathed, not the words she didn't say. He stood, letting height draft behind him. "I dare you," he declared, and the ballroom sound folded itself to make space. "Right here, right now. Dance this with me." The gasp that traveled the linen and silver wasn't from shock so much as delight. Rich people love a spectacle so long as it doesn't leak on them. Veronica's eyebrows arched the way bridges do when engineers are confident. Her mouth parted to release a little disbelief before settling back into habit. The band eased fully into Astor Piazzolla's business, Libertango, if memory served, and gave the evening a spine. Preston slid a slim hand into his jacket and produced a monogrammed clip heavy with U.S. hundreds, the kind that smell like ink and quiet explosions. He fanned the bills, not to count them. Numbers count themselves when they're that large, but to let the idea of them tarnish the air. $10,000, he announced, the number stepping onto the carpet with polished shoes. "That's your tip if you keep up. Stumble, fall, embarrass yourself, and you get nothing." In fact, he glanced at Mrs. Peterson, who had gone white as new linen. "You're fired. I'll see to it personally. That's how you cross a line and pretend you found a crosswalk." Cassie's heart did the kind of work it hadn't done since the last time she stood in a wing and tasted glue, sweat, and possibility. She looked at the money. 2 years of prescriptions, first and last month's deposit on a place without mold, a winter without extra sweaters. And then she looked at him, and the arithmetic changed. $10,000 is a tempting sermon. Contempt is a better preacher. His eyes said she was an object that could be bought, and her spine told her it had tenure. Across the room, a camera lens made a small adjustment that sounded, to a careful ear, like a man deciding to be present. Nathaniel Crow, whom most people called Nate because he favored one syllable over two when time was short, had been hired to make the wealthy look like the kind of human who blooms under flash. He had been circling Preston for his sins and cheekbones when the dare changed the weather. Now the Waitress had become an event, and Nate knew events pay rent. He leaned against a marble pillar that had held up more evenings than any donor and let the Nikon find the light that belonged to Cassie. Mrs. Peterson reached the table with the speed of a woman who had worn out 2 pairs of soles this season, saving people from their own appetites. "Mr. Montgomery, please," she said, voice low, civilized panic smoothing its hair. "This is not appropriate." Cassie didn't take her eyes off Preston because the moment would ask her again if she looked away. "It's all right," she said, and surprised herself with the strength in it. He made a public offer. I'm giving a public answer. She put the tray on the service stand, and the tiny clink of silver touching brass sounded like a gavel taking attendance. She untied her apron and folded it with the tidy respect people reserve for things that carried them through long, uncomplaining days. The black blouse and black trousers under it had always been uniform. Now, with the apron laid down, they looked suspiciously like clothes. She looked at her shoes, black, square-toed, durable as regret, and slipped them off, one, then the other. The carpet accepted each with a soft sound that felt like the room trying not to be implicated. Standing in socks made her an outlaw and a pilgrim at once. Murmurs built a little city around her. She walked to the bright square of floor that existed only because tables had been bullied aside earlier, closed her eyes, and let the lilies stop being flowers and started being rosin and old wood, let the buzz of donors turn into the hush that happens in a theater when everyone agrees, briefly, to be a congregation. "Ready when you are," she said to the man who believed readiness belonged to him. He came to her full of private lessons and public certainty, clamped his palm to hers, and snapped them both into a frame so strict it could have issued fines. He launched into a forward pattern clean as a chalk diagram. For 2 measures she let him lead, pliant as a willow that has its own opinions about storms. He cut a look over her shoulder to Veronica, the "I told you" twitch that men pass around like a flask, then brought his attention home for a victory lap he hadn't earned. On the 3rd measure, she borrowed his momentum like you borrow $1 you intend to pay back with interest. Her hand on his back increased pressure by a whisper, and the pivot he thought he owned belonged to the music again. He stumbled a breath and caught himself because pride has good reflexes. The bandoneon let out a wail that remembered Buenos Aires alleys and boot heels. Cassie answered it with a body that had been hungry too long. She stopped following and started listening. Those are not opposites. They simply require different kinds of honesty. He tried a molinet, complicated just enough to impress an audience that didn't know what to admire, and she let him set it up, then laced a gancho through his intention with a quick blade of leg that drew a clean line around his balance. He froze the half-second coward's freeze when courage walks in and makes itself at home. The tables forgot about forks. Someone's breath fell off their schedule and had to be coaxed back. The music gave her permission she didn't ask for. She led him without announcing it, which is the only way some men can stand it, and pressed him backward into a grammar he hadn't learned in school. His arms, confident things, a moment ago, turned into panicked rulers measuring a map that kept changing. Sweat found his hairline and signed its name. He tried to charge his way to authority and discovered he'd brought credit to a cash-only place. Nate's shudder built a secondary rhythm that didn't quarrel with the first. The lens took in Veronica's smile cracking like paint over old plaster. Chad and Bryce attempting to manufacture applause out of confusion. Mrs. Peterson, with her hands knit together the way some people do when they don't remember the words to any formal prayer. Mostly, though, he caught Cassie's line. The spine that wrote sentences the room could read. The swivel that persuaded the floor to tell the truth. The eyes that went bright the way metal goes hot when a welder brings flame to it. Preston backed away from 1, 2, 3, reached for a flourish the way a drowning man reaches for a branch that's mostly rumor. She let him have enough rope, taught him a small mercy by keeping him upright, then spun out, precise as written music, into a final figure that left her squared to the band and him to the consequences. When the last chord landed and held, a long, lean animal breathing in the dark, she raised her arms, not so much triumphant as finished. The silence that fell didn't ask permission. Applause came like a summer storm that has waded through 5 dry Sundays. One pair of hands clapped first, then another, and then the whole room remembered how to be a crowd. People stood, men in tuxedos who hadn't stood for anything but dessert since the Bush administration, and rain clapped the air until it caught. Heat moved across Cassie's skin, the good kind that says a body earned its own respect. Somewhere back near the mirrors, a woman said, "My God," not about heaven, but about this earth, and sobered herself with a napkin. For a breath, Cassie was in another room entirely, dust floating in a morning shaft, bar cold under her palm, the stage waiting like a patient animal, and the bow that once had been hers rose in her chest on instinct. Then the chandeliers made their argument again, and reality settled like a shawl. Rich people standing because a waitress in socks told the truth to a tango. She saw Mrs. Peterson near tears, saw Nate lower his camera with a look that said he'd found more than pictures, saw Veronica in a stillness that meant arithmetic had started. Preston's face collected colors not found in nature. He had believed in a world where money could buy gravity, and gravity had sent him a bill. He yanked his money clip from his pocket, no flourish now, and tore the 10,000 free like a man ripping cloth he couldn't mend. The bills flew awkwardly, paper birds without practice, and fell around Cassie's feet in a green expensive drift. "There's your tip," he said, the words flat and hot. "You got your spectacle. Now get out." The room's sound curdled. The money lay there, arrogant as a thrown glove. Cassie looked down, and her body remembered 100 small deficits. The time she chose the cheaper acetaminophen and promised her headache they'd talk later. The winter she let the thermostat have its way. The morning she bought the good coffee grounds as a private holiday and paid for it with a week of noodles. $10,000 can buy peace the way a lullaby buys sleep. Briefly, kindly, not forever. Her hand didn't move. She lifted her eyes to him. His expression had all the softness of a brick and less charm. "I think you misunderstand," she said, the words cut thin and clean so they wouldn't bruise on the way out. "I didn't dance for your money. I danced for me." She stepped back the smallest step, the way a person does to keep floodwater from wetting their socks. My art is not for sale. Those are the kinds of sentences that make rooms sit up. She let them live without apology, then turned and walked away. Not fast, because dignity never rushes unless a stove is on fire. She took up her apron, not like surrender, but like remembrance, slipped her feet back into the shoes that had carried so much weight for so many hours, and moved toward the service door that breathed steam and onion and the honest noise of work. Mrs. Peterson reached out with a sound that had her employee's name in it. Cassie gave her a small smile that could have patched a quilt. "It's all right," she said softly. "I think I quit." The door swung, and the kitchen took her in with clangor and heat and a relief that felt like a humble benediction. Out by the floor, where money lay like autumn leaves nobody owned, a voice carried in that cultured way only practice can teach. "That's the first interesting thing that's happened at one of these in 20 years. The speaker was Gregory Bishop, compact, wiry, hair like a silver halo that had chosen mischief over sanctity, who had choreographed Broadway so often it occasionally wrote him thank you notes. He had been halfway to leaving when the tango stitched a hand through his jacket and sat him back down. Now he leaned forward, a man whose blue eyes measured more than distance. He had seen technique that wasn't store-bought, passion that didn't come with labels, hunger wearing shoes it meant to outgrow. "Find out who she is," he told the assistant at his elbow, and the assistant began to move the way the quick do when they sense the beginning of a story that will want names. Preston stood in the applause's wake like a ship that had kissed an unexpected reef. Veronica's hand touched his forearm and then came away as if heat had made it a bad idea. "Let's go," she murmured, not in sympathy, but in strategy. He didn't hear the suggestion. Humiliation had built him a small room inside his skull, and he was busy pacing it. The service door still breathed kitchen air, and he stared at it like a man calculating ruin. The Montgomerys did not tolerate embarrassment. The creed was older than glass and newer than conscience. Against the pillar, Nate scrolled his shots and shook his head the way men do when they fished a golden thing out of mean water. He had the smirk and money frame, the socks on carpet, the tangle where she owned his momentum, the closing pose with the chest that said, "Finished," and the chin that said, "Remember me," and the green drip by her feet with Preston's fury in the background. He didn't know yet which outlet would pay best for this particular slice of justice, but he knew a headline when one wrote itself in his viewfinder. He felt the small, hard click of luck meeting preparation and tucked it in his pocket like a coin he meant to keep. In the kitchen, steam fogged the air until the stainless tables looked like ghosts of themselves, and the hiss and rattle of work made a kind of hymn. Cassie let her back find a wall and let the wall accept the weight. Her hands shook now that doing was done. A dishwasher slid a glass rack into a machine that roared like a short temper and, without turning, asked if she was okay. She told him she was, because some truths demand privacy before they can grow. Outside the back door, the city blew a December breath down the alley, letting its 35 degrees Fahrenheit do a little good hard work. Cabs argued with lights on Lexington. The park unrolled its dark in the north like a rug someone forgot to beat. Word had already left on quiet feet. It ran in the memory card in Nate's pocket and the phone of a donor with better reception than judgment. It traveled in the sentence an assistant would whisper to a director in a car. It flashed through a manager's eyes, who knew a resignation when she heard one. The money still lay on the carpet, ceremonial as a mistake that refuses to learn. And every bill said the same thing to anyone who had ever been poor enough to hear a paper talk. I am powerful until I am not. The band, professional and practical, slid into something calmer while the floor staff began to coax plates back into their scheduled lives. A busser bent to gather the hundreds and then didn't because no one had told him whose money it was, and he had been taught better than to guess. A volunteer from the foundation fanned herself with the program and said nothing. People who work around donors learn not to name weather. The chandeliers held their light like mothers hold crying babies, firm, patient, a little proud. Back in the alley, the night tasted like iron and time, and Cassie let the cool through her lungs. Her socks were back inside those stubborn shoes. Her apron was folded small and clean. Pride, thin, durable, stubborn as a weed between sidewalk cracks, stood up inside her, not to be admired, but to be obeyed. She had refused money in a room where everything and everyone had a price. In a city that sold lifestyles by the square foot, she had, the city doesn't always notice when a line is crossed inside its ballrooms, but it usually notices the aftermath. By the time the Gran Astoria's chandeliers dimmed to their midnight glow, and the caterers were stacking silver trays in the scullery, a different kind of current had started threading through Manhattan. Rumors leave parties faster than taxis, and this one had a fresh coat of scandal. Cassie walked home through Queens with her shoes in her tote and her socks folded into a damp knot. The subway carried her like an afterthought, a steel animal that smelled of brake dust, tired coats, and a faint sweetness from someone's half-finished churro. She kept her head bowed over her phone, ignoring the screen's frantic blinking. Numbers she didn't know had begun to call. Texts from coworkers had begun to crowd her inbox. She didn't answer. Not yet. The echo of applause still rattled inside her ribs, loud enough to silence everything else. When she finally pushed into her apartment, 4th floor, no elevator, walls thin enough to overhear her neighbor's nightly television debates, she set her tote down and touched the chipped counter like it might steady her. Her mother's breathing came from the bedroom, even and raspy in sleep. The hum of the old refrigerator joined in, a domestic duet. Cassie leaned her head against the cupboard door, exhaling a laugh that was too fragile to be amusement. She had quit her job. She had defied a man whose family's name was carved into half the skyline. And she had walked away from $10,000 scattered at her feet like unholy confetti. Her chest tightened with two truths at once. One was liberation, the clean burn of telling arrogance to go hang itself. The other was fear, rent due in 2 weeks, medication refills in 3, and no paycheck coming Friday. Freedom and terror make an odd couple, but they're often housemates. Morning carried news faster than alarm clocks. The first ping of her phone was from a friend who still worked catering shifts. The link came with no greeting, just a frantic string of exclamation points. Cassie clicked. Nate Crow's photographs filled her screen like windows she'd forgotten were open. The headlines sprawled across them in brutal, glittering type. Millionaire heir dares, waitress to dance, she wipes the floor with him, walks away from the cash. The shots told the story without needing captions. Preston fanning his cash like a conjurer, Cassie mid-spin, eyes lit by music and fury. Preston's face twisted into humiliation. The $10,000 sprawled on the floor like play money. Below the photos, Nate's words painted the whole scene with sharp strokes: arrogance, defiance, triumph. Cassie sat on the edge of her bed and felt the room tilt. Her mother's cough from the next room brought her briefly back to earth, but the article kept pulling her forward. She scrolled through the comments, where strangers had already crowned her a heroine. This is the queen we need. Preston Montgomery is what happens when money replaces personality. Give this woman a Broadway stage right now. The chorus grew louder with each line, each share. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. Yesterday, she'd been invisible. Today, she was a headline. And yet the grocery bill, the prescriptions, the leaky faucet, they were still waiting. Applause couldn't pay Con Edison. By late afternoon, her name was on more lips than she could count. Internet detectives with too much free time had discovered her full identity, her old Donovan Academy programs, even photographs from forgotten recitals. A stranger had started a GoFundMe labeled a tip jar for the gala dancer. Its goal was $10,000. By 3 o'clock, it had surpassed 50. Meanwhile, uptown, the Montgomery penthouse office simmered like a pot left too long on a burner. Preston Montgomery Jr., shorter than his son but built of steelier alloys, slammed his fist on mahogany so hard a row of jade figurines trembled. The New York Post lay spread across his desk, headlines screaming, "Tango of the Tyrant." His son stood pale and defiant, trying to wear arrogance like armor, though it had already rusted in the night air. "She embarrassed me, Dad," Preston III muttered. "It was a joke that got out of hand." His father rose, voice as sharp as chilled gin. "A joke? Our stock dropped 4% this morning. That's hundreds of millions wiped out in the pre-market because you couldn't resist bullying a waitress. Investors are calling. Board members are calling. St. Jude's Foundation has condemned your behavior and is rethinking our partnership. You've taken a sledgehammer to the Montgomery name. Veronica Davenport had already announced her irreconcilable differences to the press, her red lips smile intact in every paparazzi shot. Chad and Bryce weren't answering calls. Preston III stood alone, the weight of ridicule pressing like an extra suit he couldn't shrug off. His father's glare carved through him. "You will fix nothing," Preston Jr. said, coldly. "You'll sit in your apartment. You'll speak to no one. You'll stay quiet until I decide otherwise. Your public life is finished for now." The younger man slunk out, humiliated for the second time in 2 days. Pride, once his only coin, now bought nothing. Back in Queens, Cassie heard a knock at her door that sounded different from the others. A rap, precise, professional. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a tailored suit, hair sharp enough to cut. "Cassandra Riley?" the woman asked when Cassie cracked the door. "Yes. My name is Monica Vance. I'm the personal assistant to Mr. Gregory Bishop." Cassie's breath stilled. Gregory Bishop, the choreographer whose name had lit Broadway marquees for decades. The genius behind Crimson Corset, Asphalt Sonnets, and shows that still played in her memory like half-forgotten lullabies. "He was in attendance at the gala," Monica continued evenly. "He was very impressed with your performance. He'd like to meet you tomorrow morning at his studio in the theater district." 10 o'clock. She handed Cassie a thick cream card embossed with a simple address. When the door closed, Cassie leaned her back against it, the card pressed to her chest. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a cruel joke. It felt like a door cracked open. Gregory Bishop's rehearsal loft sat high above the theater district like a crow's nest that had seen too many storms but refused to fall. The elevator groaned as if every floor it passed added one more complaint, then spat Cassandra Riley out into a space washed pale by Manhattan's morning. Dust twirled lazily in bars of light that cut through tall windows, as though the particles themselves were warming up for class. The old oak planks underfoot bore the scars of decades, each groove a notch from sweat, rosin, and the blunt insistence of ambition. The air itself had a flavor, lemon oil, trying to mask the iron tang of bodies that had worked too hard yesterday and would work harder today. Cassie stopped near the doorway, gym bag biting into her shoulder. She wore a gray sweater stretched thin at the elbows and leggings that had lost their argument with time. The sight of herself in the mirror wall stung. She looked less like a dancer than a woman who had waited too many tables and carried too many trays. She pressed her palms against her thighs, as though friction could rub away the years she'd surrendered. Beneath her ribs, nerves drummed out a nervous little tattoo, equal parts hope and doubt. At the center of the room sat Gregory Bishop, perched on a wooden stool like a farmer surveying weather he already understood. Small, wiry, with hair the color of moonlight gone unruly, he wore his black turtleneck like armor. His eyes, icy blue cutting and exact, rested on her with the cool patience of a man who had watched hundreds of hopefuls rise and fall. "Miss Riley," he rasped, his voice scratched raw by years of cigarettes and shouting counts across studios. He didn't bother to stand. Posture was theater, and theater was his second language. "Thank you for arriving." Cassie hesitated, then offered her hand. His grip was firm, skin dry, the kind of handshake that said he had never wasted time on flattery. "I'm grateful you asked me," she replied, though her voice betrayed the weight she carried. Bishop gestured at the room with a lazy sweep. "Morning light is honest. It strips costumes quicker than any critic." He placed a metronome on the floor between them. The brass pendulum caught a flare of window glare, but stayed still, a mute witness. "What you did last night, it wasn't luck. It was choice, phrased with skill. Better men than that spoiled boy have crumbled under easier tunes." Cassie let her eyes drift to the wall of mirrors. The reflections staring back carried fatigue in her shoulders, but something brighter in her gaze. A coal that had waited 4 long years to be touched with breath. Her calves still buzzed with the ghost of the tango. Her chest carried the memory of applause she hadn't thought she'd ever earn again. "I didn't plan it," she confessed. "He dared me." "It was either dance or let him own me." "Plenty of souls make plans," Bishop muttered. "Few have the spine to gamble in real time." He rose, joints cracking like the prelude of a snare drum. "Tell me about your training." The word training unlatched a floodgate. Cassie's mouth filled with names and years she thought she had buried. Started in Taketti fundamentals, knees like iron, discipline drilled into bone. Picked up Vaganova styling in high school, arms curved like water. Donovan Academy layered modern on top, Graham contraction, Forsyth's broken lines. "I used to live between technique and fire until it ended." "And you walked away," Bishop said, a statement rather than a question. "My father's company," she answered, each word worn thin from overuse. "Construction supply out in Brooklyn. 30 years of sweat poured into it. Then came a big condo project on the waterfront. Looked like salvation. He borrowed, hired, stocked warehouses. 6 months in, the developer pulled out, used a zoning clause so tiny it could have been printed with a sewing needle. They found a cheaper supplier overseas. My father lost the business, then the house, then his health. A heart attack leveled him right in our kitchen. He survived, but nothing else did. Her fingers trembled, and she laced them together to steady herself. My scholarship covered tuition, not rent, not Mom's medical care. I told myself I'd leave Donovan for a semester. One semester turned into 4 years of trays and rent notices. Bishop tilted his head, already knowing where the trail led. The developer? Montgomery Corp., she said, the name rolling out like rusted nails. I didn't put it together until this morning. Preston Montgomery III, the same smug heir who dared me. His family signed the contract that killed my father's livelihood. Silence settled, heavy as sand. Bishop's jaw tightened. The universe, he murmured, pacing a thin line across the studio, doesn't mind symmetry. It delights in cruelty. He stopped, turned, and his eyes lit with a fire of recognition. I'm building a show, Echoes. It follows a woman who loses everything, then claws her way back through art. I've auditioned 300 bodies across 3 cities, all neat, all hollow. None had the kind of truth you carried on that floor last night. Cassie's pulse rattled in her ears. She gripped the strap of her bag as though she could anchor herself. I haven't danced in years. My body isn't ready. I'm not 20 anymore. Muscle is a miser, Bishop countered. It hoards memory like coins under a mattress. Soul hoards more. His voice softened, but his eyes did not. We'll train you back into form. The question isn't if you're ready. The question is, do you still burn? Her thoughts snapped back to the ballroom. The humiliation, the dare, the fire in her veins as she spun him into clumsy ruin. The sound of applause that had tasted like salvation. She let her breath steady. Yes, she said. The word rang through the studio like a bell struck clean. Good, Bishop said, clapping once. Monday, 6 sharp. Not 6:05. Leave your ego with the umbrellas. Pride may stay, but arrogance pays rent elsewhere. The elevator swallowed her again, coughing her back onto the noisy street. The wind off the Hudson sliced at her sweater, but she felt lighter, like gravity had given her a small pardon. She bought a coffee so strong it nearly barked, paired it with a cinnamon roll big as a steering wheel. Her body, long deprived, demanded fuel. For the first time in years, the city didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. Across town, another stage was set in a darker room. Preston Montgomery Jr.'s office looked down over Central Park with the kind of entitlement that believed even trees grew for his approval. Mahogany desk broad enough to land a chopper, jade figurines trembling as he slammed his fist. The New York Post lay spread, headline fat with ridicule, Tango of the Tyrant. Underneath, a photograph of his son wearing the face of a man unaccustomed to consequence. What in hell were you thinking? The elder Montgomery growled, voice cold enough to ice whiskey. Preston III shifted in his $1,000 suit, lips fumbling excuses about jokes gone wrong. His father cut him short. You'll read the statement. You won't answer questions. You'll look sorry. This isn't penance, it's maintenance for the stock price, not for your soul. The next day's press conference played out like a funeral for sincerity. Preston III stood at the podium, pale and stiff, reading words about regret with the warmth of a photocopier. Cameras clicked like firing squads. Reporters shouted questions. Did you apologize to Cassandra Riley? Did Montgomery Corp bankrupt her family? But he ducked out a side door that smelled of bleach and defeat. Cassie watched the broadcast on a mounted TV in Bishop's studio, body sore from morning drills. She felt no satisfaction, only the cold weight of recognition. His apology was hollow, a corporate bandage on a wound his family had carved into her life. Rage cooled into resolve, something steadier, sharper. She pulled out her phone and dialed Nate Crow. When he answered, she said, "If you want the whole story, I'll give it. Every clause, every invoice, every bruise. But it has to be all of it, or nothing." The cafe smelled of scorched beans and overworked steam wands, the kind of joint where every table wobbled and every barista wore ink on their arms like armor. Cassie chose it precisely because it was ordinary, a place where the wealthy never set foot unless their Uber dropped them by mistake. She sat in the corner booth, sweater sleeves pushed past her wrists, a folder of worn papers trembling under her fingertips. Nate Crow arrived late, as photographers often do, with his camera still slung around his neck like a half-tamed dog. His jacket smelled faintly of rain, his hair refusing to decide on a direction. He spotted her, offered a nod more cautious than friendly, and slid into the booth opposite her. The neon open sign flickered red against his cheekbones, painting him briefly like a suspect in his own story. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low enough to compete with the hiss of milk frothing. His eyes weren't mocking, more like a man measuring the load before lifting it. Cassie opened the folder. Contracts yellowed at the corners. Invoices stamped in ink that had bled with time. Copies of letters her father had written, begging for reconsideration. She spread them like cards in a game she could no longer afford to lose. "I've been carrying this weight for 4 years," she said. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from the release of finally setting it down. "The Montgomerys took everything from my father. His business, his health, his dignity. Last week, their son tried to take mine. I won't let them own the silence, too." Nate leafed through the papers with the care of a man handling evidence, not just stories. The cafe light fell harsh on the pages, making each line of legal jargon look like it had been carved with a knife. "This is bigger than a spoiled heir embarrassing himself at a gala," he murmured. "This is systemic." Cassie sipped the bitter coffee cooling beside her. It tasted burnt, but the heat steadied her throat. "I don't want pity. I don't want revenge either. I just want the truth laid out where everyone can see it. They ruin lives in boardrooms, then laugh at waitresses in ballrooms. Someone has to connect the dots." For a moment, Nate didn't speak. He stared at her like a man seeing the headline form before the article. His fingers tapped against the camera body resting on the seat beside him, an unconscious rhythm of decision-making. "If we publish this," he said finally, "it won't just be society gossip anymore. Regulators will circle. Investors will panic. They'll come after you." "They already did," Cassie said simply. Her voice carried no tremor now. "They just didn't finish the job." Outside, rain began to tap the window, like an impatient typist. The neon sign buzzed. Cassie pushed the folder across the table, her hands steady. Nate placed his palm on it, the unspoken agreement sealed in the hum of the cafe. When he left, the papers tucked under his arm. Cassie stayed behind, watching drops chase each other down the glass. Fear sat beside her, loyal as a dog, but so did something fiercer: resolve. She had been invisible for years, but invisibility was a cloak she no longer wanted. By the time she stepped back onto the street, the rain had slicked the asphalt until it shone like a stage floor waiting for the cue. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared, a cab splashed through a puddle, and Cassandra Riley lifted her chin. The storm was coming, yes, but for once, it wasn't coming for her alone. The article dropped like a brick through a glass ceiling. By dawn on a Tuesday, Nate Crow's piece hit the front page of BuzzFeed News with the kind of velocity usually reserved for celebrity arrests and political scandals. The headline sprawled across the screen in letters fat enough to choke. "The Dancer's Debt. Cassandra Riley on the True Cost of the Montgomery Empire." Beneath it, his photographs burned holes straight through the reader. Preston III's smug grin, the cash waving like a circus trick, Cassie's spin lit with fury and grace, the money scattered at her feet. But the words beneath the pictures were the blade. Nate hadn't written it like gossip. He'd written it like testimony. The contracts Cassie had given him became paragraphs, each stamped with dates, figures, loopholes. Her father's collapse was rendered not in melodrama, but in unflinching detail. The collapse of a heart, the foreclosure notice stapled to a door, the way a family business was drained like a vein. And at the center, Cassandra Riley, a waitress who once had the stage in her blood, forced down by corporate cruelty and dragged back into the light by a dare meant to destroy her. By 8 o'clock, office workers scrolled the story between sips of burnt coffee. By 9, Twitter had coined the hashtag #Dancer's Debt, and it spread like ivy up the walls of the internet. By noon, cable anchors with 2 white teeth were reading excerpts over stock footage of Manhattan skyscrapers stamped with the Montgomery name. Cassie stayed inside her Queens apartment as the world caught fire. The blinds were drawn, but the light leaking through painted the room in nervous stripes. Her phone lay on the table, buzzing itself toward exhaustion. Texts from strangers, calls from numbers she didn't know, emails piling faster than rent notices ever had. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to slow the pounding. Fame had a sound, she realized. It was relentless, metallic, and inescapable. Her mother, still fragile from years of medication, called weakly from the bedroom. "Are they talking about you, Cassie?" "Yes, Mama," Cassie answered softly, her throat thick. "But don't worry. This time they're listening for the right reasons." She said it like a promise, though the pit of her stomach still roiled with fear. Across town, the Montgomery offices were a war zone in cufflinks. The 23rd floor smelled of cold coffee, printer toner, and panic. Preston Montgomery Jr. sat at the head of the mahogany table, his fingers drumming against the wood like a slow funeral march. The board members fanned around him in a horseshoe of tailored suits, each one trying not to look like they were bleeding faith. On the wall, a television blared coverage they couldn't mute, stock tickers rolling downhill, pundits talking with gleeful disgust about predatory contracts and corporate arrogance. Preston III slouched in a chair, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow. He had thought the gala fiasco was humiliation enough. Now it looked like that was just the opening act. Every headline carried his name alongside words like scandal, abuse, entitlement. His fiancée was gone, his friends had vanished, and even the family chauffeur had stopped looking him in the eye. "This is no longer about one foolish night," Preston Jr. snapped, his voice slicing through the stale air. "This is about systemic exposure. Regulators are circling. Investors are pulling inquiries. If this girl keeps talking, we don't just lose face, we lose everything for once." Preston III didn't argue. He sat there, heat rising in his chest, his humiliation simmering into something darker. In his mind, Cassandra Riley wasn't a victim or a symbol. She was a problem to be erased. Meanwhile, Cassie found herself invited to places she never imagined. A morning show producer left 3 voicemails in a row, each one more desperate than the last. A Broadway gossip columnist hinted at cover stories. A stranger she didn't know had set up a GoFundMe in her name. By evening, it had crossed $150,000. She stared at the page in disbelief, the numbers climbing faster than her pulse. It was enough to cover her mother's medications for years, enough to pay rent without flinching, enough to buy back the time that had been stolen from her. But she felt wary, too. Money raised by strangers was as fragile as applause. It could vanish at the next scandal, the next distraction. What mattered wasn't the dollars. What mattered was the stage opening in front of her. Gregory Bishop's studio. Echoes. The chance to dance not as a waitress in socks, but as the woman she was meant to be. That night, Cassie stood at her window while the city roared below. Horns blared, sirens wailed, neon signs smeared against wet pavement. She pressed her forehead to the glass, letting the cool seep into her skin. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a spark in a city of dry kindling. And the fire she had lit in the ballroom was now spreading, bright enough to scorch even the tallest towers stamped with Montgomery steel. Gregory Bishop's studio smelled of sweat, pine rosin, and the faint ghost of lemon polish. Morning light slanted through tall windows, cutting pale ribbons across the scarred oak floor. By 6 o'clock sharp, Cassie Riley stood in the center, hair tied back, leggings clinging damp to her knees, and muscles trembling like they'd been woken from a 4-year hibernation. Bishop circled her like a general surveying his recruit. He carried a whistle. Though he rarely used it, his voice alone could cut through walls. "Again!" he barked, and the pianist struck the keys. A harsh staccato burst filled the air, bouncing off mirrors, ricocheting inside her ribcage. Cassie's legs obeyed before her mind caught up. Turn, extend, pivot, collapse, recover. Her breath came ragged, heart hammering against the confines of her chest. Sweat beaded down her temples, dripping into her collar. Each movement reopened an old ache. Each lift reminded her how far she had fallen from the Donovan years. Yet under the exhaustion lived a spark, the reminder that her body still remembered, even if clumsily. Inside her head, doubts whispered, "You're too old, too broken, too out of practice." But the louder sound was the pianist's relentless rhythm and Bishop's voice snapping like a whip. "Don't dance it, live it. The floor isn't your enemy. The music isn't your leash. Show me what broke you, girl, or else don't bother showing up tomorrow." Cassie ground her teeth, pushed through the burn, and let the anger coil into power. She slammed her heel into the wood with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. For the first time that morning, Bishop's head tilted. Approval, barely visible but real. Outside the studio, the city churned with a different rhythm. Headlines about Montgomery Corporation plastered every newsstand. Talk shows joked bitterly about the heir who couldn't lead a dance. The stock continued to slip, sliding a full 12% by midweek. On Wall Street, traders muttered about liability exposure, while in Washington, whispers of a federal inquiry began to grow teeth. Preston Montgomery Jr. moved through the storm like a man carrying a dagger under his coat. His penthouse office had become a command bunker, buzzing with lawyers, publicists, and the acrid smell of too much stale coffee. On the wall screen, reporters dissected his son's failures with the glee of vultures. "This isn't about tango anymore," Preston Jr. growled to the circle of attorneys. "This Riley girl has turned herself into Joan of Arc with better turnout. If we don't end her credibility, she'll torch everything we've built." His words landed heavy, followed by the sound of papers sliding across the table. Dossiers, surveillance notes, legal drafts fat with clauses designed to strangle. Preston III sat slumped at the edge of the meeting, a shadow of arrogance still twitching behind his jaw. Every insult, every headline, every clipped piece of laughter had carved into him. But humiliation had fermented into something uglier. He wanted Cassandra Riley gone, not just out of the spotlight, but erased. Meanwhile, Cassie left Bishop's studio each night with her body screaming in revolt. Her feet blistered, her shoulders burned, her calves clenched like fists. She limped down Broadway in sweat-soaked clothes, blending with the city's shadows, yet her spirit hummed louder than the traffic. Pain was no longer a sign of defeat. It was proof of resurrection. At home, she iced her ankles while her mother dozed in the next room, the TV murmuring about scandals Cassie no longer had to hide from. Each headline was a reminder. Her silence had ended, and her voice carried farther than she'd ever dreamed. Still, fear lingered in the corners. Fear of retaliation. Fear that Montgomery money could still crush her beneath another contract, another lawsuit. One evening, Nate Crow stopped by rehearsal, camera hanging against his chest like a second heartbeat. He captured her mid-turn, hair flying, face locked between agony and exultation. "The story isn't finished," he told her quietly, reviewing the images on his screen. "They'll hit back. But the world already chose a side, and it isn't theirs." Cassie met his gaze, sweat shining under the harsh overhead lights. "Then let them come," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I've danced with worse demons." And outside, in penthouses smelling of polished stone and fear, the Montgomery family sharpened their knives. Morning after morning, the studio became her crucible. Cassie rose before the city's sirens, strapped tape across raw blisters, and hauled herself back into Bishop's oak-floored kingdom. The place was always cold at dawn, the kind of chill that stung the lungs and made every tendon creak. But once the pianist dropped a chord, heavy as a falling brick, the room swelled into fire. Her body fought her, knees barked like old dogs, shoulders cramped as though iron bands had clamped them. But beneath the pain, a rhythm reawakened. She began to hear the old ghost again, the thump of an audience's collective breath, the hush that falls before applause. It was both memory and prophecy, and she clung to it like a rope across a chasm. Bishop never coddled. "You're not a waitress here, Riley," he barked during one rehearsal. "You're either a dancer or a ghost. Choose which one you want to be." His words hit like slaps, but they steeled her spine. Each correction carried both cruelty and care, the way a blacksmith hammers red iron not to break it, but to shape it. And Cassie, aching and drenched, discovered she preferred pain with a purpose to the numb fatigue of invisible labor. Meanwhile, outside that studio's four walls, the city spun her story like cotton candy. Talk show hosts snickered about the heir who tangoed his way into disgrace. On late-night comedy, a skit portrayed Preston III tripping over his own tuxedo while a waitress in socks cartwheeled across stage. Newspapers ran double-page spreads, from waitress to warrior, Cassandra Riley stand. Some treated it like theater, others like gospel, but all of them kept her name aloft. With attention came venom. By midweek, Montgomery Corp's PR machine ground into gear. A whisper campaign slithered across social media. Cassandra Riley was unstable, a failed student, an opportunist chasing pity. Anonymous accounts spat venom at her inbox. A blogger suddenly uncovered doctored photos suggesting she had stumbled into shady side jobs, grainy, blurred, and laughably fake, but loud enough to stir suspicion. One morning, a glossy magazine ran a headline: "Is America's New Darling just a dancer in distress?" The article quoted unnamed sources who claimed Cassie staged the whole thing for attention. She read it in the break room between rehearsals, her coffee trembling in her hand. For a moment, nausea rose sharp and bitter in her throat. But Bishop glanced at the magazine, then tore it neatly down the spine without comment. The sound of paper ripping was louder than any denial. "Ink can lie," he said flatly. "Bodies don't. Keep dancing." That afternoon, Cassie threw herself into practice with a fury that startled even herself. She spun until the floor blurred, kicked until her calves knotted, flung herself into a lift so fierce that Bishop's assistant gasped. Sweat poured down her spine, but with every step she felt the lies falling away like brittle leaves. Still, doubt shadowed her. At night she lay in her Queens apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling. Her mother's breathing rattled gently in the next room. Cassie scrolled through comment threads, half praise, half poison. "She's a hero," one stranger wrote. "She's a fraud," another spat. And between those two verdicts, she felt her heart tighten, unsure which world she truly belonged to. Nate Crow kept sending her photographs, shots from rehearsals, her hair mid-whip, her face grim with determination, her body straining against fatigue yet alive with defiance. In his captions, he kept it simple: "This is the truth they can't bury." On the other side of town, Montgomery headquarters stank of desperation. Lawyers shuffled papers thicker than bricks. Publicists drafted apologies no one would read. Preston Jr. paced like a wolf in a cage, his eyes bloodshot. "If she wants war," he snarled, "we'll give her war. Find me a judge. Find me a lawsuit. Breach of contract, defamation, slander. I don't care. I want her buried under paper." Preston III sat in silence, hatred simmering under his skin. Each headline was a nail hammered into his pride. He scrolled through pictures of Cassie, radiant in motion, while the internet mocked his every stumble. Shame had curdled into obsession. He wanted her silenced, not just with lawsuits, but with something harsher, darker. The first lawsuit arrived on Cassie's doorstep in an envelope so thick it could have been a novel. Legal jargon snarled across pages, accusing her of defamation, of reckless disregard for truth, of damaging a company's sacred reputation. She read it at her kitchen table, her mother watching with wide, frightened eyes. The words blurred, the weight of Montgomery money pressing down on her like a collapsing ceiling. But instead of crumbling, Cassie laughed. The sound shocked even her. "They're scared," she whispered. And somehow that truth steadied her trembling hands. She folded the lawsuit back into its envelope, tucked it under a stack of rehearsal notes, and returned to the studio the next morning. Her shoes squeaked against the scarred oak as she took her mark. Bishop nodded once, and the music rose again. Pain roared through her ankles. Fear howled from the corners. But above both, Cassie danced, fierce, relentless, alive, because she knew the Montgomerys had declared war. And for the first time in 4 long years, she no longer felt like prey. Broadway smelled different on opening night. The air itself had a pulse, thick with perfume, cigar smoke, and the restless chatter of 1,000 expensive throats. Outside the theater, velvet ropes held back a crush of paparazzi, their flashes strobing like lightning across a summer field. Names hissed from lips: Gregory Bishop's comeback show, the mysterious new lead, the heiress of scandal. Tickets had been scalped for prices fit to make bankers sweat, and every seat inside the house gleamed with anticipation. Backstage, Cassandra Riley stood in the narrow corridor where dust met grease paint. Her costume clung to her shoulders, black silk that shimmered faintly beneath the overhead bulbs. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and dye, but beneath it, her skin burned with adrenaline. Her feet, wrapped in fresh shoes, felt both alien and alive, as if the floor beneath them had been waiting 4 years for her return. Bishop moved like a hawk along the wings, hands clasped behind his back, muttering corrections to no one in particular. When his eyes landed on Cassie, he paused, the lines of his face cut by both tension and pride. "Remember," he said, voice low, raspy, "this isn't about them. Not the critics, not the cameras, not even the Montgomerys. Tonight's fight is between you and the silence that tried to swallow you. Don't just dance, burn." Cassie nodded. Her mouth was dry, her pulse a drumline, but her spine had never felt straighter. In the audience, a different storm brewed. Preston Montgomery Jr. sat in the third row, expression carved from granite, his lawyers flanking him like sentinels. The lawsuit was still warm, filed with the courts that morning, but tonight he wanted spectacle. His son, Preston III, lounged stiffly beside him, eyes darting like knives. The humiliation of the gala had never faded, it had fermented. And now he wanted her ruined beneath Broadway lights, her triumph smothered before applause could crown it. The house lights dimmed. A hush swept across velvet seats, broken only by the cough of some society matron and the shuffle of programs. From the pit, violins breathed awake, low and trembling. Then a single spotlight cut the dark like a blade, and Cassie stepped into it. The first notes landed, sharp, mournful, electric. She moved, her body unfurled like something half-buried clawing its way to daylight. Every pivot carved air, every reach drew blood from memory. The stage boards groaned under her, welcoming her back as though no time had passed. The music surged, and Cassie's soul surged with it, spilling across the theater until silence itself seemed to lean in, listening. The audience was transfixed. Here was no waitress balancing trays, no victim cornered by wealth. Here was a force, a woman rebuilt from ashes, each step declaring her survival. In row 3, Preston III shifted, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against the armrest. He had come to see her stumble, to see her break. Instead, he watched her turn humiliation into coronation, and every cheer that would follow promised to cut him deeper than a lawsuit ever could. Backstage, Bishop watched with narrowed eyes, his lips curling upward not in joy, but in vindication. He had gambled his reputation on a waitress in black socks, and the gamble was paying dividends finer than gold. Cassie reached the crescendo, the music's final, furious cry. She leapt, twisted, landed with the grace of thunder finding earth. The spotlight froze on her, arms outstretched, chest heaving, eyes ablaze. For one heartbeat, the theater held its breath. Then came the roar. Not polite applause, but a flood. Feet stamped, hands thundered, throats screamed. It rolled over her like a tidal wave, rattling rafters, shaking chandeliers. Flowers rained from balconies, petals scattering across the stage like confetti. The sound was physical. It struck her chest, lifted her spine, made her skin prickle with fire. Cassie bowed once, twice, but her eyes swept the crowd until they landed on Preston Montgomery. He sat stone still, trapped in the spotlight's afterglow, a man who had thrown $10,000 at her feet and lost everything money could not buy. Their gazes locked across velvet and shadows. Hers steady, his broken. And in that silent duel, Cassandra Riley understood. The dance was never about proving her worth to him. It was about reclaiming it for herself. As the curtain fell, the theater trembled with chants of her name. Cassie stumbled into the wings, body collapsing, chest burning, but her spirit soared higher than the marquee outside. She had done it. Against arrogance, against money, against the machinery of a dynasty, she had danced and remained unbroken. For Preston Montgomery, the night was a grave. For Cassie Riley, it was rebirth. By sunrise, the newspapers already had their verdict. Echoes premieres to standing ovations. Cassandra Riley shines in Bishop's boldest work yet. From Waitress to Broadway star, the dance America won't forget. Headlines screamed her name across front pages, each one paired with photographs that caught her mid-leap, arms flung wide as though she'd wrestled the sky and claimed it as her own. Critics who once sneered at Bishop's eccentric gambles now wrote with near-religious fervor, "Riley doesn't just dance, she resurrects." Social media drowned in clips of curtain calls, audience videos shaky with awe. Strangers called her a hero, a phoenix, the embodiment of defiance. Within 48 hours, Cassandra Riley wasn't just a name. She was a phenomenon. But success carried shadows. Montgomery Corp staggered like a boxer still swinging after the bell. The lawsuits they'd filed against Cassie were laughed out of court, judges unimpressed with papers thick on bluster and thin on truth. Investors fled like rats from a burning ship. Shares slid another 10%, and the Montgomery crest, once stamped across Manhattan glass towers, became shorthand for arrogance. In the family penthouse, Preston Jr. raged against televisions he could no longer control, his empire unraveling thread by thread. Preston III slunk from sight entirely, seen only in paparazzi snaps of a pale figure ducking into black cars, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollow. But humiliation is a slow poison, and it does not vanish. Cassie felt it even as she soared. The theater smelled of flowers and fresh paint, but somewhere beneath she caught the faint stench of smoke from bridges Montgomery money might still burn. After the final bow of each performance, as she left through the stage door into a crowd of autograph seekers and cameras, she felt a tremor of unease. Triumph could light a city, but it also drew enemies, like moths. One night, as she unlaced her shoes in the dressing room, Nate Crow appeared in the doorway, camera slung across his chest. "You know this isn't over," he said quietly. His tone wasn't warning, but truth. Cassie looked at her reflection in the mirror, the lined eyes of exhaustion, the trembling lips of relief, and behind them both, the quiet blaze of defiance. "Let them come," she answered, voice calm. "I've learned how to fight without lifting a fist." Outside, the marquee glowed her name in 10-foot bulbs, throwing light across Broadway like a challenge. And somewhere high above, behind shuttered penthouse windows, the Montgomerys watched, plotting, waiting. Cassie knew the story hadn't ended, but for the first time in years, she welcomed the next chapter. She had her art, her stage, and a truth no money could silence. The curtain had fallen on the old life. A new one had begun, bright, perilous, unyielding, and she was ready to dance straight into it,